Hello and welcome to Gadget Joe, and today we're taking a look at a very budget conscious NVMe drive. That's a 1TB drive from Fanxiang. Hello and welcome to Gadget Joe, and today we're taking a look at a 1TB NVMe Gen 4 drive by a company that you probably never heard about. When it comes to buying storage for your PC, if you want to run games or your boot drive, you do often need to be looking at an SSD drive. Now, when it comes to SSDs, there are plenty of options. You've got the standard SSDs, which have a 2.5-inch drives that you can sit into your computer system, and these are generally quite cheap for a large amount of storage. Now, obviously, you can go higher amounts of storage for much cheaper in terms of a mechanical drive, but mechanical drives are pretty much an old thing nowadays. So when you're looking for modern storage, you're looking for an SSD. Now, even a 2.5-inch SSD nowadays is classed as quite old technology. That's because we now have NVMe drives. Now, we're currently sat at Gen 5 in NVMe drives, and I do have some Gen 5 drives coming into the channel. So if you don't want to miss out on any of those reviews, don't forget to click subscribe for the channel to make sure you don't miss out on those. But going back to this one, this is a Gen 4 NVMe drive. Now, a Gen 4 NVMe drive is pretty readily available, and most modern or newer motherboards will support Gen 4. Now, what does it mean by Gen 4? Gen 4 basically offers higher write speeds and read speeds, and it just has a higher data transfer rate from your motherboard to the drive, from the drive, and so on. So if you're wanting to have high speed access to all your data, or alternatively, high speed writing of your data to your system, then you're going to be looking at something like this. Now, the speeds of a Gen 4 drive compared to the 2.5-inch SSD drives are night and day. Now, an SSD drive generally tends to top at around about 500 megabytes of write speed and 500 megabytes of read speed if you get a good example. When it comes to Gen 4, I've had some NVMe Gen 4 devices that actually go upwards of about 6,000 megabytes per second of read speed. Now, write speed does tend to fall quite low because obviously it takes more information to write data than it does to simply read it. But saying that, you can generally get some Gen 4 drives that will go upwards of about 5,000 megabytes per second. So you can see the significant boost in performance. You'd expect to pay a lot more for a Gen 4 NVMe drive, and that's not really the case nowadays. You can pick up a 1TB drive like the one that I've got in my hand, and I'm going to cover this in a little bit more detail very shortly, for around the £50 price mark. Now, the drive that I have here currently is a drive by Fanxiang. Now, when I got this, it was a company that I've never heard of before. Usually when you search Fanxiang into Google, it comes up with Amazon and AliExpress and those sorts of companies. And generally speaking, when you order drives for any sort of hardware from companies like that, it's quite synonymous with some backhanded companies that aren't always quite up to scratch. So I was quite keen to get my hands on this when the company approached me and said, "Do you want to review one of our drives?" And I said yes, because I'd like to see how it stacks up compared to some of the big name brands. The price wise isn't massively competitive. Again, you can pick these up for about £50. I will leave a link in the description as to where you can get one for the cheapest price that I can find as of recording this video. Now, I have seen them go as low as £40, but generally speaking, they fetch around £50 to £55, which puts it on the lower middle range of pricing compared to its competitors. Now, you can pick up Samsung WD Black, any other drives, Sabrent especially, are a very, very good brand when it comes to storage devices, and they generally stick slightly higher, maybe peaking around £60 to £70. So it begs the question, why should I go for something like this, and can it really be trusted? Is the performance going to match up with the likes of its more well-known competitors? So the Fanxiang that we have here is the Fanxiang S690q. It's a 1TB Gen 4, as I mentioned before, NVMe drive. So what I'm going to do for the sake of this video is basically give it a quick unboxing to basically see what you get in there, and then we're going to put it into a system, into my test system, and we're going to put it under some benchmark tests. We're going to run it under some heavy stress loads to really see how it performs. Now, there's a few things to note when it comes to the technology that's involved in this, but I'll touch upon that very shortly. Now, the box itself is nice and compact. It actually looks quite professional, considering it's a brand that not many people have really heard of. They're really sort of trying to slot themselves in terms of branding, like you see on some of the other competitors for other hardware. Now the box is nice and well presented. It does have a nice image on the front of some, well, it looks like an old city from a skyline view, but I suppose it's meant to be like a motherboard. And then you do have some quite bold branding on the bottom with a little viewing window of the drive inside. On the back you get a bit of information. Unfortunately on my instance it is covered with 2 stickers. But this is just basically some basic key information about the drive. On the sides it's pretty much recycling options and some key information in different languages, including some communications for the company itself. Opening up the box, you see a simple little plastic insert, and there is a quite large user manual, which as you can see here stretches out to a concertina sheet of paper that is quite extensive. Now the reason this is quite long is because it is multi-language. It does have a lot of different languages on here. With it being sold on Amazon and AliExpress, it will be sold worldwide. The tray itself just simply lifts away and you are presented with the drive itself. Now, we'll talk a little bit more about the drive in a very short moment, because what we're going to do here is look at what you get in the box. Now, obviously, you get the drive itself, which is presented quite nicely. It does look very professional. Once again, it really does tend to fit in with some of the more expensive offerings. You do also get a little screwdriver with the packaging as well, and that's nice to see, something you don't see very often. Now, when it comes to mounting these drives, these screws are impossibly tiny. Unfortunately, it is one of those things, and they are quite easy to misplace. One of the key things as well is not everybody will have a screwdriver that will fit the tiny little screw. Now, it does come with a screw as well, so that you have the screw to mount it to your motherboard. And then that little screwdriver just simply helps to secure it into place. Now the drive itself is a 2280 drive. What that means is it's 22mm along here and 80mm in length. So it will fit in most PCIe NVMe drive bays, because most motherboards generally have a 2280 or even a 22110 bay, so that you can fit some even bigger drives in there. Now there is some nice branding on there, and this branding here is quite thick, and that is because it also doubles as the heatsink for the drive. Now most motherboards will come with heatsinks that are primarily used for these drives, and they will do a better job than the standard heat spreaders that you see on the drives. But if you don't have that on your motherboard, this heat spreader should be more than enough for a Gen 4 drive. Now that heat spreader is, as far as the company is concerned, it's a graphite coated copper layer with a aluminium foil layer underneath it as well for thermal control. You will see just underneath it there are some memory modules, and these are the QLC NAND modules. Now the S690Q operates under QLC NAND free technology. Now what that means is quad level cell. Now quad level cell is great technology because it's faster than triple level cell, which is a slightly older technology, but the trade-off is the fact that the endurance rating of these drives isn't quite as well endowed as some of the TLC offerings. Now most of the bigger brand names, when it comes to their drives, they tend to use TLC NAND, because it's just a primarily more enduring offering. What that means in layman's terms is effectively look at the size of this table here. You start filling up everything on this table, and then you quickly start to fill up the memory of the table, which is in this instance the drive itself. You've got 1 terabyte of space. So if we had this table as 1 terabyte in size and we started putting everything in there and filling it up, eventually we're going to have to start to erase some of these parts of the memory to reuse them again. And that is what is called PE cycles, which is program erase cycles. Now when it comes to storage devices, they have multi-level cells built within. Now a single level cell, or SLC, offers up to a 100,000 PE cycle. That means that you can effectively rewrite everything that's on this table up to 100,000 times before the drive starts to fail. When it comes to MLC, which is multi-level cells, or effectively dual level cell, that will offer you the same principle but up to 10,000 cycles. TLC, which is triple level cell, that falls slightly short, under 3,000 cycles. And then QLC, which we have right here, is a quite dramatic drop. it is rated at 1,000 cycles. So effectively you can fill this drive up to 1,000 times and then rewrite over it up to 1,000 times. And now it does sound quite a dramatic drop, but generally speaking, for consumer use, a device like this using QLC NAND is going to have no issues, because unless you're going to be really writing some intensive data on this in terms of video editing or photo editing, then this is going to cause no issues at all. For a standard drive, as a boot drive, it's going to be more than enough to pretty much run the life cycle of your current PC. The same again with gaming. You're going to have no issues using this as a gaming drive. Now when it comes to storing games, nowadays you're going to need a lot of memory anyway, because most games are going upwards of about 200, 300, 400 gigabytes on some games. So having a 1TB drive as your boot drive and gaming drive on a drive like this using QLC NAND is really going to be beneficial, because that QLC NAND, whilst it doesn't have as many cycles as obviously TLC, it is a much faster drive overall. Now Fanxiang, I'm probably butchering that name. Now Fanxiang currently rate this at 4,800 megabytes of read speed and 2,900 megabytes of write speed. And that's what we will see later on in the video when we put it into the system to give it a test and then run it under some load to really see just how accurate those findings are. If we can get close to those estimated numbers that they claim for the price point, this is going to be a very solid offering. What we're going to do now is get this set up in my test bench, and we're going to do some testing on it, and then we will find exactly how it performs. When it came to testing the S690Q, I ran it through multiple benchmarking suites to test the sequential read and write times under different file and packet sizes to try and get some accurate results. For the sake of the testing, I am using a Fanxiang S690Q 1TB NVMe drive on an ASRock Taichi Lite Z790 board with an i7-13700KF with 48GB of Patriot Viper Elite 5 DDR5 RAM and an Innerchill RTX 3080 Ti. To begin with, I ran it through AS/SSD with 1, 3 and 5GB file size test. AS/SSD contains 6 synthetic and 3 copy tests to get a more accurate finding of results for read and write speeds. Starting with a 1GB test, we can see we got a score of 4435, which is a combined score of both the read and write tests, with a sequential read speed of 4118 and write speed of 2702 megabytes per second. On the 4K test, we got a 66 read and 244 write speed. The 64-thread 4K test yielded an 877 read and 1923 write, with an overall access time of just 0.015 milliseconds for the read and 0.016 milliseconds write time. We repeated the same test with a 3 and 5GB packet file size and got some similar results with a very similar story and overall score. Some very impressive results nonetheless. For the next test, we put the S690Q under Atto's benchmark suite. This benchmark software does a very similar job to AS/SSD, but this time round it breaks it down to a higher degree and offers a more comprehensive result. With an input-output size of 512 bytes to 64 megabytes across all tests, I carried out 3 separate tests using a 256 megabyte, a 1GB and a 32GB file size. On all tests you can see the read and write speeds are very much identical in terms of reaching their limit, peaking at around 4.5GB per second read and 2.7GB per second write. The key thing to note here is that the results were all very consistent and stable, which is a very interesting and welcome result for the drive. I'll expand a little bit more on that very shortly. For the final test, we ran the old faithful of drive benchmarks, and that is Crystal Disk Mark. This works very similarly to AS/SSD, and as you can see after running the test with a 1GB, 2GB and an 8GB file packet size, this time round we got some slightly elevated numbers over previous tests, with a high of 4796 read and 2888 write, with some equally impressive scores on the random 4K test too, showing just how capable the drive is even with a larger file size for transfer. And that pretty much wraps up our testing, unboxing and overview of the Fanxiang S690Q, a very capable little 1TB NVMe drive by Fanxiang, as I've mentioned multiple times. This has really quite surprised me because it has got some solid performances. Now, it's not the fastest SSD on the market. The drive itself has been very surprising. The results are very consistent and they're pretty much on par with exactly what Fanxiang stated the numbers were. Now the Fanxiang S690Q actually gave some solid numbers. Obviously the high was what we found was 4.8 gigabytes or 4,800 megabytes per second, and that's for the read speed, and the write speed was topping at around 2.8 gigabytes or 2,800 megabytes per second, which is very respectful. Now there are going to be some other products on the market that you're going to pay quite a premium for. Now this is where the argument for this device comes in over the higher price ones, because why should I spend 2, 3, maybe 4 times the price of a equivalent sized SSD, NVMe SSD, that's also a Gen 4, when I can get this for £50? And that's a very good question. With this one, we've got some solid performances as we've seen in the testing, but when you do pay a higher price for another SSD, you're not getting ripped off by these other companies. Yes, you're going to pay a premium for some brands because it's a more competitive market out there, and if you're already an established brand, you're going to start charging a premium for that. But as we can see on the screen now, I did the same test with another NVMe SSD drive, which is also a Gen 4 card. It is the Patriot Viper VP4300 Lite, and it's a 2 terabyte one, so it's not a 1 terabyte one, but that doesn't make any difference. This is one of the drives that I recently covered on the channel, and this is a very, very solid performer. So once again, it's a Gen 4 NVMe SSD with a slightly higher capacity, but regardless of the capacity, the drives work very similarly. And as you can see here, when doing the same test, the ASSSD score ran in at an impressive 5841 read and 5506 write, with a total score of 8807, which when you compare it to the S690Q's 4435, shows a massive, in fact a very significant increase in performance. The same again with Atto. We got a maximum of 6.63 gigabytes read and 4.13 gigabytes of write speed for the VP4300, the Patriot SSD. And then Crystal Disk really did sort of blast it out of the water with an impressive read speed of 7106 and a 6572 write speed. So you could argue that a brand name effectively SSD is going to be a better SSD. And whilst that's technically correct, that's not the point that I'm trying to get to for a drive like this. Now, the Patriot Viper card that I just mentioned is probably classed as one of the highest end NVMe SSD drives, at least with a Gen 4 technology on the market. And again, you're going to pay a premium for a card of that size. You can pick up the SSD that I've just mentioned, the Patriot one, for around £150 at a push, and sometimes it can top upwards of £200. So again, you're going to be paying a premium on the price point, and that's where this one comes in, because this is a drive that costs £50 compared to the £150, potentially £200, and you're getting a probably maybe 30, 40, at some points 50% performance increase. So yes, it could be justified if you are looking for a ultimate performance SSD and you do rely on those really high data transfer speeds. If you really do make use of that, and obviously you do a lot of rendering or editing or anything like that that would really take advantage of that high performance, then you shouldn't really need anything more than this. Now again, I'm not slating the Patriot because the performance is fantastic. In fact, I run that as a daily on my main system. It is absolutely faultless, and if you're looking for a review on that one, I will leave a link in the description so you can go and check that one out if you are looking for something along those lines. But the fact that you can get a solid performing SSD for £50 with some really solid performance and some really quite respectable read and write speeds, which are going to do you more than adequately enough, then you really should consider something like this. Now obviously there are a lot of cheaper SSDs on the market, but you'll find that the technology that they use is probably not always the most reliable. Now this one obviously doesn't utilise a lot of the technologies that the Viper does use, and obviously the onboard chipsets and everything like that are quite considerably lower performing than the ones on the Viper. One key thing that I did notice that this one really does do well at is the consistency. And when we bring up the Atto test again, as you can see with the S690Q on all 3 tests, the read and write scores were very, very consistent. They all increased up to a point and then they peaked at that point, but they remained solid and secure and confident in the results that they would found, and obviously everything kept really consistent. When it comes to the Viper, however, on Atto test, as you can see, The read was very consistent. It reached its peak and it stuck there and it stayed there. But the write speeds were incredibly sporadic. They were all over the place. And that's something that I did find on the review of the Viper when I did that. So that's something to take into consideration. You've got a SSD very similar in performance to its higher end competitors. Yes, you've got a slightly slower speed, read and write speed compared to them, but you've got a very consistent performer. And that for me is a very, very big bonus, and it's definitely something to consider. So if you are after a new SSD for your system, or you're upgrading to an NVMe drive and you're wanting something that is going to be solid, consistent, and a very, very solid performer, then this is definitely something to consider. As always, I will leave a link in the description as to where you can get your hands on one if you do want to get one. And for me, if you're looking for an SSD to upgrade your system, or you're just building a new system, maybe a gaming system, this will do that absolutely perfectly and more than adequately. If you're wanting to go for some higher performance, then obviously look at options like the Viper or some alternative brands. And that's pretty much it. So this is my review of the Fanxiang S690Q, a very surprisingly capable little NVMe drive. Now obviously if you're going to go for Gen 4, that's Gen 5, that's a whole new world of performance, but that's not what we're looking at. What we're looking at here is a Gen 4 drive that will do everything you need it to do quite quickly as well, and with some really solid consistency. The fact that you can pick it up for 50 quid is an absolute bonus. So if you have to upgrade in, go check it out on the link down below. Once you're down there, don't forget to click like on the video, because it really does help the channel. And if you haven't already, hit subscribe so you don't miss out on any future videos. We've got lots coming, and that's pretty much it. I've been Gadget Joe. This has been the Fanxiang S690Q 1TB, and until next time, goodbye.